One of my favourite things about the London Underground is its architecture. It is gorgeous. But quite apart from that, you can also tell a lot about the history of a station from its architecture. Today we're going to travel along the Jubilee line and see what we can learn. Now, the Jubilee line can be divided into 5 sections, stylistically speaking. We'll start in the west at Stanmore. The Stanmore branch wasn't actually built for the Jubilee line, it was built for the Metropolitan Railway, and opened in 1932. For the Metropolitan Railway, that was actually pretty late. It would be taken over by London Transport the following year. In the early days of the Metropolitan, it had seen itself as a contender, a mainline railway to compete with the big boys. But by the 1930s it had settled into a more sedate identity. It was a commuter railway, and that's okay. One of its major selling points was a concept they called Metroland. That is to say, suburbs built around the Metropolitan Railway station, which, their publicity material promised, would give residents the relaxed pace of country living with the convenience of the city. Many of the new housing estates of Metroland were developed by the Metropolitan Railway themselves, albeit through a technically separate company. Once you know all this, the stations on the Stanmore branch make a lot of sense. The architect in charge was C.W. Clark, and when Clark got out to the suburbs, he really went in for the Metroland style. These stations are designed to basically look like country houses, the sort of place a wealthy man might have in the sticks for when he fancies going hunting, or hiking, or golfing. The Metropolitan were weirdly obsessed with golf. Actually, when the Stanmore branch opened, it wasn't very heavily used. When London Transport came to review the figures, they wondered if the architecture might actually be the problem, that the stations were so similar to houses that people just didn't notice them. London Transport had inherited an enormous system with an enormous number of problems. The Stanmore branch wasn't very heavily used, but other parts of the Metropolitan were too busy. Management's solution was this. The Bakerloo line, which had plenty of extra capacity, would take the Stanmore branch over entirely. Then it would take over stopping services between Wembley Park and Finchley Road, leaving the Metropolitan line trains free to skip them. At Finchley Road it would dive into a tunnel and head for Baker Street. At Baker Street it would join its original line and head for Elephant and Castle. The section from Wembley Park to Finchley Road is kind of a mishmash of architectural styles. Wembley Park itself was rebuilt in the early 2000s. Basically its entire function is to get people in and out as quickly as possible en route to the stadium. I don't know, it's not a station I can get excited about. Neasden dates from 1880. This is an older Metropolitan Railway building, albeit one that has been modified a lot over the years. It's a good illustration of the sort of thing the Metropolitan was doing back then, back when it didn't see itself as a metro line. Dollis Hill represents a later style. It was rebuilt in 1938. Now, the architect in charge at London Transport back then was Charles Holden, who is perhaps the most famous London Underground architect. His style was very much based around bold, simple shapes, with a bit of Art Deco streamlining. Dollis Hill is actually not a Holden station. It was designed by Stanley Heaps, whose legacy seems to be that he was very good at imitating more famous tube architects. Willesden Green's street-level building is very interesting because it's another C.W. Clark design. But whereas the stations on the Stanmore branch were designed to blend in, Willesden Green is one of his urban stations designed to stand out. From Finchley Road to Baker Street, the line dives into a tunnel and we get more 30s styling. This section was entirely new when it was built, opening in 1939. The style at platform level at Swiss Cottage and St John's Wood is very typical of this era. I think of this style of tiling as New Works programme style, because most of the stations in this style were built as a result of the 1935 New Works programme. So you've got it at Highgate on the Northern Line, you've got it at Bethnal Green on the Central Line, and you've got it here. I'm particularly fond of these relief tiles that have various symbols related to the stations on them. From Baker Street to Charing Cross, you have the first section of line built specifically for the Jubilee line. More or less from its inception, London Transport was fighting a war against overcrowding, and the Jubilee line was planned to take some of the weight off the existing lines. This would take over the Bakerloo line from Stanmore to Baker Street, then would strike off on its own to Charing Cross. From there, the aim was to extend through the city and out to the Docklands. Things didn't quite work out that way, but that's another story. The section from Baker Street to Charing Cross opened in 1979. Because the line was intended to relieve other lines, and because it was built on the cheap, it was added to existing stations. But there's some very 70s style decoration at some of the stations along here. They seem to have been very fond of yellow, orange and grey. You can see it at Baker Street, Bond Street, Green Park and Charing Cross. Well, you can't usually see it at Charing Cross, because that bit closed in 1999. More on that in a couple of ticks. There's also some theming. Baker Street has images from the Sherlock Holmes stories. Bond Street has images of parcels, reflecting Bond Street's status as a shopping district. Green Park has leaves, for obvious reasons, and Charing Cross has Nelson's Column, being as it is right next to Trafalgar Square. The final section, at least for now, is Westminster to Stratford, commonly known as the Jubilee Line extension. This was a kind of compromise between two plans. One was London Transport's original route, and the other was a private railway planned by the Canary Wharf developers, Olympia and York. Because the route wasn't as planned by London Transport, it meant that part of the 1979 section had to be abandoned. Everything west of Green Park. On the plus side, it meant that Westminster could be added to the route. It had been skipped the first time around. The architectural style on this section is all brutalism. It's steel and concrete, all industrial looking. Huge and open plan, and about as far from the country cottages of the Stanmore branch as you can get. Spiritually, and, now I come to think of it, physically as well. And that is really where we wrap things up. In my opinion, the change in styles along the Jubilee line represents the change in status of the tube. The Metropolitan Railway sought to be gently unobtrusive. The London Underground brought a bolder style. The 70s saw a tube that couldn't afford to be too bold, that many politicians saw as a form of transport that would be superseded by cars in the not-too-distant. And in the 90s, a system that was here to stay, an essential part of London, and don't you forget it. Well, I do hope you enjoyed this stylish tale from the tube. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I might do more videos like this for other lines. Let me know if that would be of interest in the comments below. If you're interested in the abandoned platforms at Charing Cross, check out the London Transport Museum's Hidden London tours. They often give tours of Charing Cross, and they are great. I would like, as always, to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your always appreciated support. You are the tiling to my platform. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.